Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Krisha, and on behalf of DWG, we're honored to invite you to our second lecture of our Vanishing Point series with the title Climate Change and the Sustainability of Justice. I would like to begin by acknowledging that many of us gathered here digitally are calling in from stolen Indigenous land. I, as well as the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism, are located in the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We offer this acknowledgement as a reminder for our shared responsibility to the land and acknowledge how grateful we are to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. I'd like to thank all those who made today's event possible, including but not limited to the DWG lecture team consisting of Alex, Angela, Daniel, Federico, Sally, Saruga, Thompson, and myself, and our wonderful speakers for today, as well as our moderator, Aron Chang. For today's event, we ask that you keep your mics muted for the main panel of the discussion, but you will have the opportunity to unmute yourself at the end during our Q&A session with the audience. Today's event will be recorded and posted on the DWG website for future reference. So if you're uncomfortable with your video, please turn that off.
Prior to diving into this engaging lecture, we want to provide a little more information about DWG for those unfamiliar with our work. DWG stands for Diversity Working Group, and it is a student-led working group established to hold the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism, including faculty, accountable towards creating a more equitable learning environment for the BIPOC community at our school. The foundation of DWG revolves around our three pillars: advocacy, education, and community support. Each of these pillars are columns that are integral to the structure of DWG. Today's lecture ties into these aims by extending each pillar into our community. We are advocating for the BIPOC community through acknowledging, justifying, and fostering conversation on how our current environmental and climate crises continue to disproportionately affect them over time. Today's discussion will acknowledge how climate change is disproportionately affecting Black, Indigenous, and racialized people over time. One factor that addresses this issue is that the BIPOC and racialized communities are placed near high-risk environments with polluted resources. Specifically, settler colonialism has modified the ontology of native land to property, disrespecting Indigenous principles. In Winnipeg, the traditional unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe is expropriated by the government and faces infrastructure discrimination through the Shoal Lake 40 aqueduct, which displaces the Indigenous community, denies accessibility to potable water, and promotes infrastructure discrimination through depriving them of institutions necessary for survival. We will focus on issues of accessibility in relation to sustainable practices, as well as the inclusion of marginalized people in these practices. For instance, redlining is a systematic practice of denying services to BIPOC and marginalized residents, placed in informal settlements with fewer resources and opportunities. Gentrification thus contributes to this increasing rate of these residences gaining a low income, making sustainable and equitable practices expensive and inaccessible. To wrap up, we will discuss the future of sustainability and equitable practices. As Aron will explain further, the discussion is divided into three main parts dealing with status quo, unsustainability, and solutions in practice. The most important part of this lesson to take from all this is that there's no way to confront the climate crisis as a technocratic problem in isolation. It must be seen in the context of austerity and privatization, of colonialism and militarism, and of the various systems of other needing to sustain them all. Naomi Klein.
Okay, so it's my honor to introduce the guest speakers and moderator for today's discussion. We are joined by Sheryl-Ann Simpson, Cheyenne Sundance, Zoe Todd, and Aron Chang as our moderator. So to begin, Sheryl-Ann Simpson is a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Carleton University. Her research is based on public practice design projects and speaks on the role of sustainability from both a local and a global scale. Her work is strongly informed by the practices of feminism and critical justice, with a focus on using methods and technology to promote increased social justice. She explores these interests through questions around citizenship and immigration, environmental justice, and urban health in a way that links theory and action together in real space, culture, and experience.
Cheyenne Sundance is a self-taught urban farmer and founder of Sundance Harvest, a food justice-centered, year-round urban farm located in Toronto. She is a food and community justice advocate and leads the way in how we protect biodiversity and reinvent a more equitable, anti-racist world at the community level. She believes cultivating one's own food builds the basis of liberation for BIPOC communities, and she provides opportunities to marginalized youth for establishing and empowering food and land sovereignty movements. Zoe Todd is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University. As a Métis anthropologist from Amiskawashiwash, I'm so sorry, I'm unable to pronounce it, but it's also known as Edmonton. Zoe Todd's research is based on the multifaceted relationship between people and fish in the context of colonialism, environmental change, and the legal governance of Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. Her publications and work approaches issues of the Anthropocene through a critical Indigenous feminist and ecological lens to incite conversations about Indigenous self-determination, peoplehood, and more than human relations.
And finally, our moderator, Aron Chang, for today. So Aron is an urban designer, educator, and artist in New Orleans, Louisiana. He focuses on water infrastructure, resilience, and climate adaptation through community-based planning practices. He anticipates chemistry between various resources and elements in order to propose methods to harness them for a greater purpose. He's a co-founder and co-lead of the Water Leaders Institute and is currently working on the New Orleans Water Map and Gently Resilience District. So we hope you enjoy this engaging discussion about equitable and sustainable solutions that explore the intersection of racial and environmental justice in both practice and policy. I'm now going to hand it over to Aron so he can get the discussion started.
Hey everyone. Really good to see some people I know and meeting a lot of people for the first time, and really honored to be a part of this, panel and to join the Carleton University both this semester and this evening. I think one of the things that we want to do is for each of the speakers and for myself to share a little bit about the land that we're calling in from. I think that last night I was thinking about this conversation and thinking about how strange it is if we're able to step out a bit and to think about the fact that we're all sitting, for me, dozens of miles apart from you all, and we're all staring into these flickering screens, and that's the form of connection that we have right now. And even though we tend to think of the digital world as being more ephemeral and more abstract, I think it's important to note all the ways in which even this interaction, these flickering screens, are still rooted in different practices and extractions and exploitations that are happening to real places and real communities. So I think in that context, it's extra important, despite this digital medium, to reflect on the land that we are each a part of. So I'll lead off and say that I'm calling in from New Orleans. Before that, and it was known as Balancha, which is Chata for land of many tongues. So just as it is today, it was a place where there were many different tribes coming together to exchange goods, and people moved in and out of the bayous and the riverbanks and the wetlands on a seasonal basis, and also in relation to the cycles of the river as it changed course over time. So the Choctaw and the Chitimacha are two of the tribes, but dozens of tribes inhabited different areas in and around Balancha and what is known as New Orleans today. So I came to be situated in this place after growing up. I was born in Taiwan, grew up in California in a city called Irvine, which didn't exist until the 1970s. And so if you study urban planning, you might study Irvine as a completely master planned community, and where most of the people in Irvine are like me, many immigrants and people who had no prior connection to the land. And so I think much of my life, without knowing it, I've been searching for places and communities where deeper connections exist and are manifest in the foods people eat and the clothes and the architecture. And I think we have that in spades here in New Orleans. So I'm lucky to live here and see the ways in which people are rooted. So I will pass it on. Cheyenne, would you mind being the first speaker to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone. My name is Cheyenne Sundance. I'm calling from Toronto, Ontario, here in Canada. I'm on Treaty 13 land. This historically and still is the land of the Anishinaabe, the Wendats, the Mississaugas of New Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and there's a lot of other Indigenous people who are calling this land their homes today. So both of my parents were immigrants. My father, if I trace back the lineage, it was to a plantation in Jamaica. As many of you probably know, British colonialism is trash. And the ramifications of slavery in Jamaica by British colonists, I can still see that today with my family. So I'm a farmer. That's a really big part of who I am and how basically everyone knows me. I became a farmer because I really wanted to connect with the land, and that was a really important piece of my journey. And that's really probably all I'll say, because I think I'm really excited to hear what other people have to say.
Great. Zoe, would you mind going next?
Yeah. Tanse Zoe Tsigasun, Nia Orapem Suesqueo, Egomaga, Omama Winini, Niwigan, Ginanaskomi Tina Wow, Marcy, Kakyao, Nuwako Makanak. So my name's Zoe. I'm a Métis person from Alberta. I grew up in Amisquichy, Waskahigan, and it's okay. However you pronounce it is good, because we're all trying to reclaim languages that the colonizers tried to eradicate. So yeah, and I work with fish, and so I'm employed at Carleton, which is an unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Omama Winini territory. But I do most of my work now in Alberta and Treaty 6 territory, and in collaboration with communities sort of connected throughout Alberta. So yeah, today I'll probably speak about things from the perspective of the impacts that colonizers have had on freshwater fish habitats and what that means for Indigenous sovereignty, but also what it means for sort of like the imaginary capacities and possibilities we have across communities that have been impacted by colliding genocides in Canada and the US. And yeah, fish is sort of this potential site across which maybe we can envision different ways of building beyond the colonial nation state.
Thank you, Zoe. Sheryl-Ann?
Yeah. Hi. First, thanks so much to the organizers for the invitation to be here. I'm like already energized by the conversation. So yes, I also work at Carleton, which is in the city of Ottawa, which is hosted on Algonquin-Agee, but it's not hosted in the sense of having been invited to be here, and it's not even hosted in the sense of having permission to be here, because as Zoe already explained, this is unceded Algonquin territory. So there's no treaty. So unlike a city like Winnipeg, where folks are breaking the treaty, at least there's some kind of relationship that was there at one point that's now being broken. Ottawa never even bothered to try and build the relationship. So it's a peculiar place, right? To be. And Aron, your point about sort of the ephemeral nature of digital spaces, I think is really interesting and important, and comes back this idea of land in the sense that, if we think about, how we're zooming in, one of the ways that I'm zooming in is because of the electricity that is being, shunted into the space. And some of that electricity, or a lot of that electricity, is hydroelectric electricity that comes from dams that are built on the Ottawa River, the Gitchissippi, sort of the Great River. And so part of the thing that's happened because of these dams is that the eel population in the Ottawa River has dropped about 99%. There's basically been this sort of destruction of the eel population. And I bring that up in part because of like, you know, the relationship, I think, between land and water that's really important. And I also bring it up because I think one of the things about any kind of land acknowledgement that I'm learning, right, because I'm also learning these things myself, is that it's not just about sort of saying, oh, this is where I am, but it's really about that question of relationships. And so eels have been a really interesting way for me to understand the relationships that existed in Ottawa in pre-colonial times, and also to think about the possibilities for relationships that could exist. So eels have this like really wild sort of spawning and migration pattern where they'll hang out in places like the Ottawa River for like 20 years, 30 years, maybe even 40 years. And then they're meant to go back downstream to where they came from to spawn. And in that travel, they do things like pass through Mi'kmaq territory. And so there were these like long-standing relationships between Algonquin nations and Mi'kmaq nations that were built through the eels. And then the other thing is that they spawn in the Sargasso Sea, which is in the Caribbean, which is where my family is from, in the West Indies. Something about, for me, there's something about that idea of this like funny little fish that I hadn't really thought about, right? Making the same kind of trips and travels and connections that my own family has made, but also thinking about the ways in which, you know, my ability to live here has directly impacted their livelihood. And so there's lots of different ways that we can think about our relationship to the land, and that we can think about our relationships to the folks who have been stewards of the land since time immemorial, and thinking about our own place and position. And that's just a quick story about how I'm trying to learn and understand about that relationship.
Thanks so much. I think what we're going to do, the organizers developed a wonderful structure where we're going to talk about, we're going to start by trying to ground these themes exactly in this question of land and water. And then we're going to shift to talking about what the organizers called unsustainable sustainability. So what are the practices that are actually causing harm in conventional sustainability practice? And I would add to that resilience practices, and asking all of us to be very specific about policies and programs, and to use the specifics to maybe bounce out to bigger picture understanding. And then we'll wrap up by talking about solutions in practice. So looking forward, how can we shift some of the ways in which these policies and practices are developed, and who's at the table, and who gets to author these policies and practices, and how might that shift some of what's happening in the environments that we inhabit. We're going to start each section generally, and this changes. I think we can be flexible, but the goal is to start each section focusing on stories and asking each speaker to share a story that speaks to that theme. And then we'll let the conversation flow from there. And as we wrap up that section, we'll try to hone in on specific words that came up for each of us that we think is worth a bit more thought, a bit more reflection, or that there are tensions embedded in how that word is used in our respective practices that might be worth kind of just calling out, so that we leave this evening with maybe a few concepts and words sticking in our brains. I think I love that story about the eel. I learned earlier this year from a scientist to look at the maps of trade winds and the triangle trade, and the same winds that were used to move ships, bring in enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean to US, are also some of the same winds that are directing hurricanes up into, so that consonance between economic and ecological different forces in relation to the things that underlie all this, which is land and water and air, I think is something for us to look for and to recognize and to learn from. I'd love to ask each of you to share, if we're trying to start off by talking about land and water, can each of you share a story that lets us get into that conversation and maybe start to get at the perspective that you bring to your work and your engagement of these issues?
I can start. I can tell, I'll tell a story. I was actually I realized I was like, oh, I should have found that picture. So I thought I'm doing that bad thing that I do now where I'm talking, but I'm also, because I'm on my computer, I'm like, oh, I can also try and find things. But I'll tell a story. So I lived in California for probably about, I guess like maybe 5 or so years before moving to Ottawa. And it was during a period that I refer to in my work as being the Great Drought. And basically, it was a time in California that's, I mean, to some extent still going on, but one of the things that was happening basically was that it was some of the lowest levels of rainfall in the state of California that California has seen in just really ages. And this went on for quite a long time as well. And one of the things about California is that the politics of water are always very contentious, and for lots of different reasons. Part of it is that a lot of California is a desert. And so probably people shouldn't be living there, and certainly not as many people as do. The other thing is that California is the sort of fruit basket, I guess I would say, you know, not just even for the US, but also for Canada, right? A lot of the food that we end up eating, especially in the winter months, you know, comes from California. And so agriculture obviously has a really huge like need for water. So water is this like very contentious thing. And then during a drought period, it becomes even more contentious. And so as part of the kind of policies to try and mitigate against this drought, or really adapt to the drought, the state basically said that all the cities in California had to reduce their water use by about 10%. And in California cities, about 50% on average of water that gets used is used outside. So it's literally people watering their lawns and their gardens. It's about 50% of the water that people use is in that kind of use. So one of the things that happened in a lot of cities, and I'll share an image of this. One of the things that happened in a lot of cities was that the cities started to try and figure out like how to convince people to use less water. And so one of the things that happened in the city that I was living in Sacramento, was that they put in all these different kind of policies to try and reduce water use. And so you would see things like this, where there would be signs like this that said sort of, the grass isn't brown, it's gold, and gold is the new green. And so that was kind of the messaging that they were trying to get, was to convince people during the hot, dry summers to not water their lawns to keep them green, but to let them go golden, because that was like going to be like a sort of a status symbol. They wanted it to be. So having said that, they also put in a bunch of policies like saying that people could only water their lawns at certain times of day and during certain days of the week. And if you saw your neighbor watering on the wrong day or the wrong time, you're supposed to call them in and like let the authorities know that they were watering their lawn on a Thursday afternoon instead of a Wednesday morning, which a friend of mine who grew up partially in Soviet Russia said felt really, really familiar to her. The other thing that happened was that homeowners, not renters, but homeowners, were also given money, and they could change their lawns into this form of lawn. And this is a landlord who owned several homes across Sacramento, and he was being brought up as being like this kind of champion because he had applied to the city and then gotten all this money to be able to make these changes in his front lawn. Now, again, he didn't live in any of the houses that he was changing. He just got this money because he owned them as property. And so for the folks that were living in this house, they now had to deal with these weird changes that had been made. So if they had a dog or if they had kids, all of a sudden they didn't have a lawn to play on because their landlord was this drought champion. Now, for me, I was a tenant at the time who was like really like all in, super psyched to turn my lawn golden, but I had a landlord that was that. And so I actually ended up getting in a bunch of trouble with my landlord for doing what the state had asked us to do as, you know, responsible citizens of the state. So I bring this up in part because it comes up into my research, and I'll keep on kind of talking about this case probably, but some of the research that I was doing, because what I wanted to try and understand this from an environmental justice perspective. So thinking about the ways in which policies might be well-meaning or not well-meaning, but how do they actually play out in real people's lives? And how do they actually play out in terms of like whose imaginaries of what counts as a good, you drought, who gets to be a drought champion and who gets to, get in trouble with their landlords, who gets to decide which landscapes are desirable and who gets to decide which landscapes aren't desirable. And so I'll stop there, but I think just in terms of that idea of status quo, I think this was actually a really good idea of seemingly making really big changes, but actually the status quo being maintained because the folks who are actually in charge of it were kind of the folks that are often in charge. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I wonder, Cheyenne, I wonder if you wouldn't mind speaking next. I think this question of land and just the different owners of land, I think the question of stewardship comes up for me, who's responsible for the dirt, for the groundwater, for the stuff growing on top, and what are the motivations or the narratives or policies that are in place to shape our various land stewardship practices or lack thereof. And love to hear your thoughts on that and any stories you care to share.
Yeah, I can share my experience with land and stories with land. So as I kind of spoke about in the beginning, I largely see myself as a landless person, primarily because of the experience that my ancestors have had with transatlantic slave trade, and understanding that to be placed in that way, it's very hard to understand where you really call home. So when I started farming, that was a big piece of getting to know the land as someone who really can't trace back on either side where they called home. And I think there's something beautiful with farming is because the soil can be your home, and you can grow food from the soil, and that food can nourish you and your community, and then you can call that home in a way. So I've always been really in love with that idea of just having the earth being a place that I can call home, as someone who has had historically a very landless experience on both sides of my family. But with farming, when I started farming, I knew that despite it being organic, ecological, and all that stuff, it would be nothing if I didn't actually try to build relations with the people who are the traditional people of this land and still are today. So with every plot that Sundance Harvest took over, and Sundance Harvest, if you guys don't know, it is a 2-location site. So there's 1/3 of an acre at this park in Toronto called Downsview Park. There's 2 greenhouses and a bunch of land. And then there's a second location on a rooftop farm that's a flower farm for Sundance Harvest. But before that, the very beginning of Sundance, I started talking to this really radical Anglican church nearby Trinity Bellwoods Park. They're really queer and really cool and everything that I love. And they were talking about how they have this plot of land behind the church and they don't know what to do with it. And I was like, well, can I just take care of it? And can I tend to the mulberry tree? And can I grow things? And there was an albino squirrel there, and that squirrel was so happy to see me all the time and had babies, and I had a relationship with that plot of land. And despite me feeling so landless, that plot of land felt like home. It was right around the block. I got to bike there on summer nights, hang out with friends, and have a wonderful Black community, be able to call this plot of land home in a way. We got to gather, we got to grow, we got to save seed. And it was probably one of the most nurturing experiences of my entire life I'll ever have. And from that experience, I still was understanding that I knew that this land wouldn't always be in my possession because 1, I don't see land as in having an ownership, and 2, I see it more as a relationship experience. So last year, I was in a meeting with a few people. One of them was Aboriginal Legal Services, and I was talking to Ryan Walsh, someone who works there, and he kept speaking about how the work they do is very one-on-one, it's counseling based, it's very community oriented, and they try to do it outside to ground people in a setting that is calm. But they couldn't find any location because of the pandemic. Things really switched around for them and they couldn't do it indoors anymore. And then I started realizing what the community meant to me when I had that plot behind that church and how I felt so whole. And I got to experience all the different the birds and the squirrels and the mulberry tree and the black walnut tree, and I got to feel totally embodied. And then I realized that what would be really radical and really not even radical, but just right, is to say, well, why don't I transition this over to you? And I see the tending of land and the way Sundance Harvest does as a relation builder. I knew that if I just gave them, you know, a raw plot of land without being tended to, then that wouldn't really be so much of a relationship to start with. But I gave them this plot that was tended with love and community, and they invited me to a sacred fire when they opened up the plot this year. So my relationship with land is one who is landless, but also one who's understanding that the original inhabitants and the current inhabitants of this land have a story, and they have culture, and they have traditions. And I feel really lucky that I get to share my relationship with land with so many Indigenous people I know here in Toronto in a way that is not just, you know, of like social justice solidarity, but in a way that's actually tangible and alive, right? Like, I built a relationship with that soil. I know them, like the biology of that soil. I built that soil from like scratch with compost, and that soil is now be given to them so they can grow their crops. So that's kind of my relationship I can share with land, and how it's so living and it's always changing, and it can even be changing like our relationships and our feelings. And it's always forgiving. When we're thinking about even places like, you know, there were war zones or places that suffered like a catastrophe in nature, right? They can always come back, like the wildfires in Australia, for example, or even California. After a while, things come back. And I think that's something with land that I've always seen. So that's what I'll share. I don't want to get too over my time.
We have plenty of time, so no worries there. Zoe, would love to, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both, Cheyenne and Sheryl-Ann, because both of your perspectives are really like thoughtful and deep. And so I wanted to kind of bring in, I'm going to share my screen if that's okay, because I've got some pictures I wanted to share. So I want to think about bull trout. So in Alberta, where I'm from, in Treaty 6 territory through the Nelson Saskatchewan River watershed, bull trout have been experiencing a very significant decline over the last 40 or 50 years. And so we're doing a project looking at bull trout and also West Slope cutthroat trout, and trying to sort of also connect with groups that are doing sort of this work to try and recover habitat for native trout, what they call native trout, you know, through the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. And like, I come to this work because of family, like actually because of my non-Indigenous family. My stepdad, Wayne Roberts, who passed away 3 years ago, who is a non-Indigenous fisheries biologist, zoologist with a passion for, you know, sort of riparian, amphibian, reptile, various different sort of watery connections, and especially that sort of connection between land and water that occurs right at the shore or on the banks of rivers and streams. And so Wayne, you know, he in the early 80s was someone who, along with others, was raising the alarm about bull trout population declines throughout the areas that I'm working in today. And so here's a picture of him from 1986 when he gave a talk at the Alberta Provincial Museum of Alberta. So I would have been like 3 years old. We hadn't met yet. It would be another 5 years until he came into our family. But Wayne was, you know, doing these talks around the province, writing papers, attending these like species at risk, sort of, you know, the precursors to sort of those conversations happening in Alberta. And through his whole lifetime, you know, continued to advocate, worked with a whole sort of like host of really like sort of like cast of characters of different naturalists and, you know, fishermen and others who were trying really hard to protect Alberta rivers from habitat destruction. So, you know, a big person who's been a part of this work is Lauren Fitch, who's a retired professional biologist who has argued really convincingly that the single greatest threat to native trout in Alberta is habitat destruction. It's not recreational fishing. It's just straight up destruction of habitat through resource extraction, climate change, mass agriculture, not the kind of agriculture you're talking about, Cheyenne, which is rooted in place and so thoughtfully kind of enacted through relations, but sort of settler agriculture, municipal development, things like that. And what's kind of incredible is that it took until yesterday for the government of Alberta Department of Fisheries and Oceans to declare that area a critical habitat for bull trout. So that's like 40 years from when Wayne was first starting to publish papers about bull trout decline. It took 40 years. And so in our project, we're trying to understand, like, where's this disconnect happening between the state, knowing it knows full well that the significant, threat to these species that Indigenous societies have had relationships with since time immemorial is the destruction of land, the colonial capitalist, white supremacist destruction of land. And so I think a lot about the bull trout, because I didn't go looking for this as a project. It came to me, like it literally came through dreams, and like at every step of the way, like we've been sort of like guided through ceremony and other sort of like really rooted approaches. And our goal is to really help bring the non-Indigenous, and it's predominantly like white settler actors who their hearts are in the right place, like they're really doing work because they really care about the fish, but they are working within a system that has always sort of said that they are the rightful sort of like guardians of these spaces. And we want to help sort of remind folks that Indigenous law is so important to these conversations, and that if we start, like Cheyenne, as you described, like coming into good relation, working from a place of care, like as I've been taught by Cree and Métis legal scholars like Patty Labucan Benson and Tracy Lindbergh and others, like Cree law on the plains is the first law is love. And then everything builds from love. And so when we're working with bull trout, like I have a hard time explaining it. It's like I love bull trout, and I've never actually, I've never caught a bull trout. It's just that it's built into me because of the work that Wayne spent his lifetime doing. And he didn't do it for glory. Like he dropped out of his PhD and just spent the rest of his career basically just fishing, like just with the water, with the fish. And unfortunately, that means that he's been erased from a lot of like the academic record of this work. So there's this like huge body of knowledge that gets erased when it isn't published by the people who are sort of the like career academics. And so we're trying to, through our work, like we're calling it a restoring approach, a fish restoring approach, and really reminding people that there's so much that happens beyond the written page that is so vital to the recovery of relationships. And when we're talking about fish, like bull trout decline is explicitly an environmental justice issue because it is environmental racism, it is white supremacy, it's settler colonization that is destroying their habitat. And I personally don't think that we can rely on DFO, which is a white colonial supremacist body, to be the one that's going to, do the work necessary. It's in building these really beautiful relationships, like at the river's edge, doing habitat restoration, telling stories about fish, drawing fish, using AR and VR and other tools to kind of bring people into those relationships. And a thing that I really learned over time too is that Indigenous law has so many tools with which to develop new forms of relationships. It's anthropologists who sort of cast indigeneity as a sort of like anachronistic, backward sort of facing identity, but that indigeneity, Indigenous societies exist all over Earth and, are distinguished by sort of ways of relating to land and place that are not imperialists, that are not white supremacists, that are not colonial capitalists. And so that there are absolutely ways to develop relationships within and across different Indigenous societies, whether those here or those who have been uprooted violently by imperialism and colonial capitalism. And so I guess like a thing that I really think about that the bull trout are reminding me is that some of the most powerful work that we can do in restoring habitat is refusing to center the white colonial capitalist communities and bodies that have continued to sort of see themselves as the voice of conservation, and instead thinking about like, what do we have to learn from, refugee communities who have experienced environmental violence in their homelands or here. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm being articulate in what I'm trying to say, which is that, you know, I think that as an Indigenous person, I'm trying really hard not to center my conversations on the settler colonizers anymore, because they are not where the most generative and like imaginative conversations are going to happen anyways, because the status quo for them is working. And so they're not, it's very hard to get them to think beyond it, because it's, for them, it's the water they swim in. But maybe for some of the rest of us, the water we're swimming in is not working. So I'll leave it there, but I just think a lot about the bull trout and what they have to offer.
Thanks, Zoe. I think I can't wait to dive into a number of the topics that you brought up in the next two sections. Before we move on, though, I was looking at this lineup and looking at geography and anthropology and farming and thinking about all the ways in which we, and I work as an urban designer, but the ways in which you each are connected to questions of land. And I think about how Cheyenne talked about building soil and that direct connection of being there, being able to touch it and being in relationship to land. And that seems so simple and also so out of reach for a lot of us, I think, in our daily lives, as something maybe we aspire to or dream about or maybe read about. But I'll say it's hard for me to bring that into my everyday life. I'd love to dive into this topic a bit deeper. From your various perspectives, what are some of the reasons why, what are some of the factors that complicate our relationship to land? Why isn't it that simple, that direct, where we have a responsibility to it, where we can work on it? And maybe that's a super simplistic question, but I'd be curious to hear what you guys think clouds or makes it harder for us to have that relationship.
I can go first. I'm actually laying down because I feel like Zoom really zooms out my energy, so I like to lay down. So the various land that I'm seeing, so I run a program called Growing in the Margins, and Growing in the Margins is a beautiful program. Basically what it is it's a 12-week program for youth that are BIPOC. And these youth often are youth that are queer, trans, two-spirit, maybe they have a disability, and they had never seen themselves represented in agriculture at all, even organic agriculture as granola and as it is, right? So really what Growing the Margins does is it teaches them how to start a farm. It's like 12 weeks, you learn about composting, business planning, marketing, seedling starting, everything. You go on field trips, learn about mushrooms and all these cool different things. And with every cover letter I see, I can sense what the barriers to entry into like land stewardship or agriculture was for many of these youth. And the most common themes I predominantly see is lack of traditional knowledge. I think what Zoe said, it was really on point for the whole time they were talking regarding that people like refugees and newcomers, they have a lot of skills. They have a lot of skills that they're bringing from their home countries, whether that be environmental stewardship or just like farming and agriculture in a way that is regenerative. So like no-till agriculture, or just understanding that banana leaf compost is the best. And like I learned that when I was 18 in Cuba, just like hanging out. But lack of traditional knowledge is a big thing I'm noting that a lot of the participants in Growing the Margins have faced in their life. And that could be, for example, their parents were displaced from the home countries and their parents maybe don't really feel comfortable to talk about agriculture. It also could be a lot of the Black youth. Many of them are very dispossessed from agriculture because, as many of us know, hundreds and hundreds of years of international slave trade of Africans caused a lot of intergenerational trauma. It's hard to talk about farming when farming was a source of hundreds of years of trauma, even after emancipation with sharecropping. So I would say traditional knowledge, and probably the second thing I would say the biggest barriers is community. Growing food is a very isolating thing, and I could say that myself as someone who does this for a living and has a bunch of staff now. Before I had staff, it was very isolating, and gaining an entryway and learning to work with the land is also one of having a relationship. If you, for example, don't feel totally confident, or you didn't have that traditional knowledge or someone to guide you, you might feel a bit isolated to go on a field and try to plant corn or wheat. And for me, in my own experience, it was very difficult when I started to farm. I went to many places. I went to Cuba and I went to the Caribbean, and I saw how people grew food. And every single time, predominantly like Black communities I was hanging out in, they all grew food in community. They all grew food with each other. If it wasn't on the same plot of land, it was their next door neighbor that they bartered their mangoes for their bananas. If it wasn't, even that, it was they went to the market and then they saw all the other merchants at the market and they had all the other wares and all the other goods that they harvested from the land. And I think here, and especially in Canada and in Toronto where I live, it's a very isolated thing. It's so far removed from what I saw in the Caribbean, but rather is you do your work by yourself and then you make a profit and then you are generating income under capitalism and you're a producer. It's not so much interwoven into the fact of you're growing this food, this life-saving source, this like magical thing that happens from a seed. It's not so much talked about and celebrated. And I think that's probably the two biggest barriers I think people have access, when they're trying to get to love themselves and their community and be involved on the land, is traditional knowledge and a strong community. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. Please, Zoe.
Yeah, so I think, and a thing that I think is a major challenge that I see in my own work, and I'm not an urban planner, although I dabbled in like municipal advocacy in my 20s, and I was in the utilitarian bike crowd, and like, so kind of got a sense of how those things work in Edmonton. And I think one of the biggest challenges from an Indigenous perspective is just that sort of the reification of developers and development, and then resource extraction, like these two things that drive a lot of the extractive and violent economy of Canada. And so, those are the sort of industries that have a disproportionate say on what happens to land, even though they're in bad relation with Indigenous nations and other communities that they extract and exploit. And so just thinking about like Ottawa, as Sheryl-Ann brought up in the very beginning, like Ottawa there's no treaty for Ottawa. There's no legal agreement between the Algonquin Nation and the city of Ottawa. And, I'm not Algonquin, so, I'll tread carefully in sort of like characterizing a recent conflict, but the city said that it was enacting reconciliation recently by developing a a project through some developers, but that they negotiated with the Algonquins of Ontario, which is a very controversial move, given that there are lots of questions about whether the sort of like white colonial capitalist frameworks through which the Algonquins of Ontario have come to be identified as like a legitimate group through which to negotiate. And so Algonquin leaders, all throughout the Algonquin communities in Quebec, like spoke up, and this is explicitly problematic because there's a really huge problem in Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, sort of like what I call Eastern Canada, as someone from Alberta, but I've been roundly critiqued for that by people in Ontario, which say we are Central Canada. Martin Robinson, who is an Indigenous scholar from Australia, talks about this concept of the white possessive, which is this sort of idea that white people sort of possess indigeneity, possess Indigenous people like at an ontological level to justify their claims over Indigenous lands and to excuse sort of the violent things that they've done to Indigenous bodies. And so like developers I feel development as an act of violence in Canada because it's not in good relation. And then for Ottawa to sort of claim that they were doing this as a reconciliation move, but that they don't have a treaty with the Algonquin Nation, that they ignored the communities, like Kitigan-Zibi, which is on the Quebec side of the border, has very, very intimate ties to Ottawa. And it was just like this very classic white Ottawa move of sort of like, yes, well, we have sorted this. We're going to build some, track housing. I don't know. And then this also makes me think about like my own relationship to property is really fraught. As a Métis person, my great grandparents, one of their grandsons bought them a home with money he made as a soldier from World War II. And it was this house in a place called Rossdale Flats, which was sort of seen as a slum by white people. But we know it as this place where like there were a ton of Métis families, and it was close to the river. And my family, my aunties have stories of like going to the ice factory down the road and, sticking their heads in to cool off in the summer, like little Métis kids cooling off in this ice chute where people got their ice because not everyone had fridges yet. And yet, like in the 1960s, when Edmonton was modernizing, it built a bridge to connect sort of like quite a bit of like road infrastructure, and was building freeways. And they expropriated my family's house with no compensation. Like there's stories in my family that they just showed up, and this was a place where like many generations of the family gathered. Like when people didn't have housing, they'd come stay there with their kids. Like it was just this constantly busy, bustling Métis house in the quote unquote slums. And the city just showed up, and the story is that like they were bulldozing as my family was trying to retrieve their belongings. And so for me, like I was like, I'm a professor, like I could probably afford to buy property, but I always rent, because there's always just this like ingrained sense that like you can't trust anything, and it's better to rent and like always keep everything so that you could just throw it in the back of a small moving truck. And I think that like if I really were to think about it, it comes from this sort of sense that you can't trust that the people who run sort of land ownership in this country are going to have communities that I'm from best interest in mind. So it's just like that's an anecdote, but I think a lot about like just the violence of developers, but that there are ways we could do it differently. Like so anyways, we could look at like Vancouver and how Squamish Nation is building something that's like really rooted in community sovereignty. But I will end there. But it's something I think about a lot. That just how can we do this differently so that we actually honor plural Indigenous nations, and then also like center the needs of communities, especially communities that are being hit the hardest by COVID right now and being evicted in the middle of a pandemic.
So I'll put on my like, I think going back to your question, I'll put on my like professional hat, or my maybe like academic credential hat. And what I mean by that is that, so I teach in a geography and environmental studies program, but my graduate degrees are in community development and urban planning, urban and regional planning, or city and regional planning, I think technically. I don't know anymore. But so there's like two big ideas, right? Both in the kind of field/practice of urban and regional, or city and regional planning, and then in geography that came up when you asked this question about this sort of potential of like a disconnect between land. And so the first one is, and I'm also just like, this is what I do when I get to talk with you, Zoe, is I just copy everything you say. So I'm just gonna copy everything you're saying. Because so in planning, there's this principle of the highest and best use. And so it's this idea that like planning decisions should be made. Planning decisions are basically made plot of land by plot of land, because planning, at least on this continent, is rooted in common law and civil law. So it's rooted in the idea of individual ownership of very well-bounded plots of property, right? That's what land is. It's something that is very well-bounded and well-defined, and it's something that is owned by one actor, right? Whether that's an individual or a corporation, like it doesn't necessarily even really matter. But the point is that like, if we don't have these very clear boundaries and it's not clear who owns it, literally civilization will fall apart. That's kind of like the basis of a lot of civil and common law. And so in terms of planning, then planning takes on this ideal, right? This idea of land, right? Because it works sort of plot by plot by plot by plot. And the question is, who owns the plot of land, right? Because only one person can own it, can be in control of it. And then the question is, what is the highest and best use of that plot of land? And the answer to that question has almost always come back to the idea of what's going to induce the most economic growth. So the answer to the highest and best use for any particular parcel of land is the use that is going to make the most money for the person that owns it. And so if you think about that, right, and then you ask the question of like, you know, why would there be a disconnect between land, between like people and land? You know, to me, that's like a really key reason, right? If we look at every patch of land as being something that has these like very strict, well-defined borders that are more important than, you know, well-being, that are more important than whether or not people have, you know, a roof over their head, that have traditionally been well more important than, you know, fish or eel or squirrels or anything like that, right? Those boundaries are sacrosanct within common and civil law, right? The laws that we've inherited from England and that we've inherited from France. So that's the first part, right? That those kinds of boundaries are sacrosanct. And then on top of that, right, what you're supposed to do with that land as a planner is that your responsibility is for that land to make money, right? So when you talk about developers, Zoe, like it's totally true, right? Because developers are also in the business of making money. So they're very kind of easy and comfortable bedfellows with an ideal like highest and best use. And so an idea that we've talked about in public before is, you know, is again, this idea of if we're talking about sort of a plurilegal idea. So this idea that, you know, Canada already has two kinds of laws working side by side. It's got common law and civil law already kind of working side by side. What would happen if we also actually honored the laws that we said we would honor in the treaties that we signed, or that we found in the places that we occupy without making treaties? And so if we think about, you know, the prairies, for example, like Zoe explained, right, and if you think about the idea of a law that's based, for example, on love, right, what would the highest and best use as a planner be if, as a planner, I had to think about not just that common and civil law focus on economic growth, but if I had to think about a NEWAG or a Métis law about love in terms of evaluating the highest and best use, all of a sudden the highest and best use would be very, very different from what it has been in the past. So again, right, thinking about from my, like kind of that professional academic practice, right, that's one of the things that I'm actually trying to really think about in my teaching, and then also kind of in my community work. So putting on my other hat as like a sort of geographer, which is something I also play at on occasion, you know, when people ask you like, well, what's geography? There's lots of different ways that you can answer, but one of the ways that I've been taught and that resonates with me is that geography is the study of place, space, and scale, or space, place, and scale, depending on who you talk to. And so when we talk about this, right, it's this idea of space as not just being like a sort of box or like a container that we like slot stuff into, but Doreen Massey, who is this like really phenomenal like thinker and lovely human being who passed away a few years ago. I never had a chance to meet her, but they did a memorial for her at the sort of big geography conference in the United States. And it was just like really amazing to just hear people talk about all the different ways that she'd supported them. But she talks about space as being, I'm gonna misquote this, but she talks about it basically as being sort of the coming together of stories so far. So the way that she talks about it is that sort of space and place are those moments, those sort of physical spaces and those moments where our stories come together. Because we all kind of have these stories and we all have these trajectories and we're all kind of like walking around and doing stuff all at the same time. And so space is this way of us kind of understanding in some ways that like different things are happening, right? All at the same time. There are different laws that exist all at the same time in different places. There are different ways of understanding land that exist all at the same time in different places. There are different ways of having relationships to land that are happening all at the same time. And so that gets us kind of, so when you start to think about space that way, to me, that kind of gets us off the track of sort of an Enlightenment perspective, which is that there's one way to think about things. So the Enlightenment sort of coming out of like the 1800s in the UK, in England, and some other, you know, in France, other places in Europe. So that idea of thinking about the idea that, you know, there's one way that we learn things. There's one way that we can create new kinds of knowledge. There's one kind of law that we can have. Even that there's one kind of religion that we can have. And that we're always going to be on this straight line, moving forward, making progress, like all the time. So when you start to think about space as being these trajectories that come together, right, it's this reminder that there's lots of different perspectives that are happening all at the same time. And I think that does two things, where on the one hand, it shakes you a little bit, because for me at least, it sort of shakes me a little bit, because it makes me wonder, why do I know so much about one way of doing things, or one way of thinking about land, or one way of evaluating the highest and best use? And I know so little about so many other ways of doing it, right? Why don't I know? Why don't I know what a Dene way of doing this is? Why don't I know what a Maori way of doing this is? But even just like, why don't I know what a sort of mainstream Japanese way of doing this is? Why don't I know what, a mainstream Mexican way of doing this is, right? Why do I know so much about one way of doing this when there's so many different ways that we could be doing and thinking about things? So that's like the geography part of my brain. But I also think the other part about it is that it also kind of pushes us to be hopefully like really specific. And I think for the architects and architecture students in the room in particular, right, when we think about doing our site analysis, right, we think about that as being really about trying to understand the conditions on the site in these very sort of intimate ways. And so I think similarly, when we start to think about, what these relationships to land are or could be or should be, trying also to have that same kind of specificity in our understanding. So really making sure that the stories that we're telling reflect the place that we're in. And when we borrow stories from other places, right, understanding how those stories might have to shift or change, or being really conscious about why we're borrowing stories from different places, right? So again, working in Ottawa, on Algonquin, obviously there's things that I can learn from other Indigenous communities that aren't Algonquin communities. But, asking myself, well, why am I not, if I'm learning from another community or another nation, why am I not starting with the nation where I actually work, right? And sometimes there's reasons for that, but always kind of, having that at least in mind. And I think similarly, like for somebody who is, for somebody who is a Black person, there's a huge amount of multiplicity in Canada, and particularly in terms of what that means, right? And even where that term comes from and why we use that. And I'm happy to talk about, I'm happy to babble about that more, but also, really thinking about, what does it mean, for example, to take a term like BIPOC, which is a term that grew out of an American experience, right? Really talking about the idea that for African American folks, right, for folks who are descendants of folks who were enslaved in the US, right, they have a very particular experience with the land, right? And similarly, Indigenous folks, obviously in the US, also have very specific experience to the land. And so when I'm in Canada, as somebody whose family's immigrated here, right, I'm part of a new settler community ultimately. Our family didn't ask any Indigenous folks to move here. We didn't ask for permission. We didn't learn the language. We're not following the laws. I always have a bit of a pause, right, to ask, well, what does it mean to sort of, to use that word in a place where my experience of Blackness is so distinct from the place where the word actually came. So what are the good things about that, and what are the challenges about that? What are the responsibilities? So again, I think that idea of that specificity of place and space, I think, is another thing that that from geography helps me to understand the disconnect, but also to think about possibilities for something new.
Thanks, Sheryl-Ann. I appreciate that the word, that specificity, and also showing how they're laying bare how deeply it's embedded in our professional practices and planning the highest and best use. And I have a friend who is studying vacant land in New Orleans after Katrina, and he talked about how there was a distinct moment in time when vacant land waiting for people to return all of a sudden became blight, and it changed policy. The land didn't change; it's the same area of earth. And but all of a sudden you had task forces that the mayor convened to eradicate blight, and you had budgets and hearings to deal with the problem that all of a sudden that land became And it's absolutely a construct that was put onto this thing that never changed. Before we move on, I would love to invite each speaker to share a word that you want people to reflect on more, either through your kind of personal experience or disciplinary perspective that connected to just this idea of land and stewardship, something that you think is worth interrogating a bit more on our own. I'm not sure we have a ton of time to kind of reflect collectively, unfortunately, because I want to get on to some of the stuff that Zoe's brought up around sustainability practices and how those are rooted in white supremacist systems. And I think that I want to make sure we get to that. But if you all could maybe share a word that's come up for you and that you want us to all think about, I would really love that.
I can't wait to hear from Cheyenne and Sheryl-Ann, but a word that comes to mind for me is attunement, which is what my colleague and co-thinker Ame Kangisar is working with in their sound work in the Pacific. They are a white settler in Australia, and they've been working in Fiji and Nauru and sort of in the Pacific, working with people who are heavily impacted by climate change. And this work of attunement from like Ama's sort of perspective is about attuning to place and learning to sort of like slow down and listen. And especially as a white settler person, this is really important in their work, and they're teaching me to do it as well. And sort of like also that allows to sort of like listen to the more than human aspects of place. And sort of like, so in my work now, when I come into a place, I'm not living in my home territory. So I sort of ask it, like, is it okay that I'm here? And it will tell you. And like, it won't tell me, like, I don't know the stories of that place. They're not for me to know. I'm not part of that nation, but like place, more than human beings, like water, they will tell you if they want to work with you or not. And they have ways of like refusing or engaging. So anyways, attunement for me, like Amma has really brought me into that world, and it's really shifting. It's slowed me down and made me sort of ask, like, should I be doing the work I'm doing? And it helps me know that I'm doing it with integrity. And if I'm not, I hear very loudly in really embodied ways to stop. And I think that's very important.
Thank you.
Well, I'll quickly go. I think Cheyenne said, both Cheyenne and I think Zoe as well at some point brought this up, but I just want to, the word dirt, I don't know why, but for some reason that's the word that's resonating in my brain right now. But I think it's resonating for a couple of different reasons. And I think, again, right, this idea of like the meaning that we give to words, right? That dirt has potentially this sort of very bad connotation, right? But dirt is literally what, brings life, right? And also, dirt's like the fun version of land. Like it's what we play in when we're a kid, right? It's, you get your hands dirty when you're having fun, but you get your hands dirty when you're causing sort of like radical trouble, right? So dirt, I don't know why, but for some reason that one's sticking with me.
Love it. So tune ourselves to the dirt.
That's a hard question. So I don't want to try to get too eloquent or dreamy with my word choice to like alienate people. So I'm going to say the biggest thing I'll say is community, but I'll back it up with something that isn't as boring. So I'm learning a lot about mycelium and mushrooms because at my farm, I'm doing this like really interesting. Some people say it's a failure because it may not generate income. I'm starting like a little woodland mushroom straw, and all these mushrooms are just growing and living their life. And with mushrooms, if you know anything about mycelium, they have like a community. Like they literally live in like a spider web formation on the soil and below the soil. And without each other, they cannot really stay afloat. And the same thing with trees. Trees live in a community. When you're thinking of the shape of a tree, it never shades out its neighbor. To survive, they have to thrive as one. So I would say the word is community, because when we're really thinking about even back to every single one of our ancestors at one time had an agrarian past. Like every single person on this earth had to grow food in community to survive. So I would say the word community because it's so amazing to think about the relationships we have as a community translated into like mushrooms and trees. And it's not some weird, like not natural thing to do it all together. You can see that through anything. That's what I would have to say.
Thanks, Cheyenne. And I'm thinking back to your earlier words on community and how we can't think of our relationship to land just as an individual failing or success, but that it can't happen without community. And I really appreciated that. So let's take a breath. And I think the next topic, unsustainable sustainability practices, gold is the new green. I went, when I was in grad school, Harvard University had a green is the new crimson campaign, which is pretty funny thinking about golden is the new green. Which way are we going? And I want to just dive into what Zoe talked about. Sustainability, mainstream sustainability practices, policies, processes, and how they are part and parcel of white supremacist systems and legacies of settler colonialism. How do we recognize that? We may feel it, we may understand it intellectually, but I can say from my experience that as an urban designer, as a planner, it's pretty simple. I just look at who's at the table when I go into a planning meeting, and more often than not, it's structured into the schooling, it's structured into the professional circles, and it's structured into who shows up to planning meetings, and so ultimately who is making decisions about the future of communities. So it's visible, it's tangible in that very direct way. So that's one way in which I see it. I'm curious from your perspectives, can you point us towards real life examples so that we can see all the ways in which what Zoe is talking about is manifest in the practices and policies in the water that we swim in? How do we start to recognize that? And what impact does that have if we're able to recognize it?
I forget whose turn it is to start, so I can start. It might not be my turn, but so I'll say that two things that I'll say just to start is one that a piece that I teach, and I think almost everybody who's taken a class with me probably has read or seen some part of this piece, but Laura Pulido, who is a scholar at the University of Oregon, and she is a sort of Chicano studies, environmental justice scholar. She wrote a piece a while ago that looks at this idea of white supremacy and kind of from an environmental justice perspective, and kind of breaks it down into like three big chunks, right? Sort of like, this is what you're looking for when we're trying to understand what white supremacy is. And this isn't obviously like a definition for all times, but I think it's a useful starting place, because one of the things I think that happens when we use the word like white supremacy is that people's hackles kind of raise and they're like, no, but like, I don't hate anybody, or like, I don't want anybody, like I would never say, or I would never do. But so she breaks it back and she says that white supremacy exists when there is harm, when there is a taking, and when there is a sense of superiority. That's kind of like the three things that she breaks down. And in the article, she looks like a particular case of like a chemical company in a predominantly Latinx, Latino community in California. And she talks about how, you know, the company was causing harm, right? It was sort of just like off-gassing all these horrible things that were causing harm to the community. The company was making money by causing harm, right? Like, it saved a bunch of money because it didn't have to, you know, fix its factories, and it was making a bunch of money because of the thing that it was making. So there was a taking from that community, right? There was actually something, not just that the harm was being caused, but there was something that the company was actually gaining. And then a sense of superiority, right? Which is that the profits of that company were considered more important than the lives of the actual human beings that were being harmed by it. And so it's kind of she talks about it in terms of white supremacy, but also the way that it can be kind of used to think about, different kinds of supremacies as well, right? So if you're somewhere where the relationship between races might not be the strongest difference, right? But there might be other differences that are important. You can kind of think about those differences through this lens as well. Yes, I do. Okay, so that's one thing, I think, this idea of like harm taking and a sense of superiority, right? And then I think the other thing that I talk about in my work in some other places is this idea of representation. And so when we talk about representation, there's lots of different ways that we can define it. But one of the ways, we can talk about representation as being a reflection. So the idea, for example, of, literally, right, your reflection is a representation of you. But we can also talk about it being like a stand-in for you. And that's often what we talk about when we talk about like representative democracy, right? That the folks that we send to Parliament or Congress, are meant to be sort of stand-ins for us. And so when I think about this idea of unsustainable sustainability, I think these two things kind of like come to bear when you're sort of looking at them and trying to understand the examples. And so going back to that example that I started to talk about in California around the drought, right? We, as part of a project that I've been working on, we've been looking at this kind of question, looking at it through this lens. And, one of the things that we found is that there is a real harm that's being caused. So the drought is potentially causing harm to landscapes. But the policies are actually making that harm worse. And it's making that harm worse specifically for folks who don't have the money to just pay a fine and keep on watering their lawn, or who aren't homeowners, and so they can't get a bunch of money from the government to make changes in their lawns. But the harm is also coming from people who are not, whose imaginaries of what a good lawn or a good yard or a good sort of home landscape would be don't match with the cities. So especially in a city in California, right, we've got a really large Latino community in that area, a lot of folks who are first generation immigrants. And the vision, right, for a good landscape doesn't match the city's vision. So they're also not able to enact that vision, right, which is a kind of harm. Also Southeast Asian, and then also like a really strong core of like a longstanding African-American community, all of whom have these visions, right, for what an ideal landscape would be that don't match with the city. So there's harm that's being done there. There's also a kind of taking, because again, the folks that are benefiting from this are predominantly like wealthy homeowners, right? They're getting money from the government to like have this vision of their lawn that matches up a lot with their own imaginaries. And also there's a taking in the sense that a lot of wealthy people are just like taking water and just paying a fine because they can. So in this crisis moment, they're still taking more than their sort of fair share of water, right? And then being able to just like write a check and not care about it. And so again, there's a sense of superiority that goes into this as well, right? Because if you think about it, there's a sense of superiority first, again, in terms of these imaginaries, right? The city has decided that it knows best what a sustainable landscape should be. And their vision for sustainable landscape, to be frank, it's weak. And it's also really interesting because part of what we did as part of the study was actually to look at where they were getting these ideas from. And they're not even coming from like landscape architects. They're not even coming from like it's not even like the folks who, it's not even folks that like kind of claim authority around this, right? It's sort of just being pieced together in a lot of ways by just kind of like what they feel and what they like and how they want their yards to look like. And so that also gets back to the question of representation, where the folks who are being harmed the most aren't being represented, right? Their imaginaries of their landscape, their home landscape, aren't being reflected, and there's nobody to stand in for them in those conversations about defining what an ideal landscape could or should be. And so I think another aspect of representation that's really important is also this question of time. And so one of the other harms, I think, is a harm of time, which is to say that if you're well represented, you don't actually have to spend a lot of time thinking about this. If you're well represented, there's somebody that's standing in and that's making laws and setting policies and setting planning decisions that reflect what you would want to see anyways. But for folks that are being harmed, right, you have to spend a lot of your time advocating for yourself. You have to spend a lot of your time, whether that's going to court and paying fines because you watered on the wrong day because you wanted to have, you know, a garden that grew medicinal plants, whether that's your kids not having some place to play, you know, whether that is, you know, getting sick, whether that's not, you know, saving water from someplace else, blah, 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 blah. The point is that it takes a lot of time when you're not represented. And I think that's another really important harm that we can think about. I think especially, again, for those of us that are interested in professional careers in these areas, is to think about who are we representing, who are we accountable to in our own work, and making sure that we aren't, that, you know, it's not just that we're not causing harm, but that we're really making sure that we're representing again, this sort of, you know, this plurality of visions of what our land could be, and this plurality of visions of what sustainability could be. And I'll actually stop talking there.
I just got tired thinking about what you said about the harm of time and imagining that displayed across each aspect of society and life and policy, and how that's repeated over and over again in every arena, and that disproportionate burden of seeking representation.
So when I think about sort of sustainability and white supremacy, there's a stat that's been used a lot in the last few years. In 2017, the UN sort of argued that Indigenous peoples worldwide make up 5% of the Earth's population, but protect 80% of the biodiversity. And then Richard Schuster, who I think was doing a postdoc at Carleton at the time when he published this with some others, they published an article where they studied biodiversity of vertebrates in Indigenous and state-managed lands in Brazil, Australia, and Canada. And they found that Indigenous managed lands are as effective or more as national parks in protecting vertebrate diversity. And so when I teach that to my students, I ask them, like, why do you think it is? Why are Indigenous managed lands, you know, good at protecting biodiversity? Why are Indigenous people protecting 80% of the global biodiversity? You know, and something we kind of tease out in the courses I teach is that it comes down to Indigenous law. And when we say Indigenous people have law, like, we don't mean it, you know, Val Napoleon, John Burroughs, there's all these really brilliant Indigenous legal scholars. We don't mean it in the sense of like Parliament and the Supreme Court. It's about like the daily ways that you're in relation to others, and like how you treat one another, but also how you treat the land, how you treat the water. And like Val Napoleon, she talks about how law is a verb, like you live it. It's just this constant negotiation of existence. And so like and each nation has their own laws. And so I couldn't even begin to sort of like, you know, make equivalences across each nation. And obviously, like, not all Indigenous nations have always gotten along. Like, there's a lot of diplomatic history across nations. And so I'm not here to say that it's like, you know, there is a sort of a trope towards the ecological Indian, to use like the offensive language that entails, of like Indigenous peoples were sort of that, it's associated with Rousseau, but I know that like this contest, you know, we don't know if he actually was the one who advanced it, of like the noble savage, but like Indigenous peoples are sort of imagined as living in this sort of like paradise, but that no, actually, like, all people are human and messy and have conflict and disagree over things, and so we all have law in different ways. And so for me, like, it shouldn't have taken 40 years to protect that critical habitat in the Nelson North Saskatchewan River system if Canada was serious about honoring the treaties it has with Blackfoot, Stoney Nakoda, Cree, Saulteaux, and other Dene and other nations that are in those areas, because those were signed in Indigenous law. And at the time that Indigenous nations all across the country were signing those numbered treaties in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, they were working from a place of Indigenous law that explicitly said, you know, like, we have to protect the water, we have to protect the fish, you know. And so it's just it's a little bit exhausting, because you think about like, if we actually just really centered Indigenous law, we wouldn't need conservation policies the way that they're imagined through like the Canadian state or the US state, or even big bodies like the World Wildlife Fund. Like it was caught, you know, it was found that the WWF was guilty of hiring like paramilitary bodies in some places who murdered people to protect these state-imposed national parks in certain places. And so like, for me, environmental justice doesn't mean that people in the global north get to execute people to protect landscapes in this vision of kind of like John Muir or those other, I think that E.O. Wilson, who says that like we need to protect 50% of land mass, but he's imagining it through this very white biology sort of framework of protecting it, when in fact, no, the single greatest threat in my mind to biodiversity is capitalism, white supremacy, and like extraction. And so, yeah, I just think like Sheryl-Ann and Cheyenne have both like explicitly talked about like how we can do it differently, where we just like we're really attentive to like, am I in good relation where I am, and how do you build those relations? And so every place that I move, I try to really think about, like, even when I was living in Scotland, like how do I help repair the damage that colonialism has done to Scotland that, you know, kind of normalized the violence that Scotland then exported elsewhere. And like my time in Scotland was like explicitly heavy in my body, because you can just feel like how the land itself rejects what was done in its name. Like it's sort of like the land itself didn't sign up for British Empire, but it's now entangled with it, and it has like the bones of people trafficked, you know, through museums, like ancestors trafficked through museums are held there. And it's just really heavy. So anyways, I don't know where I'm going with this other than like just that like Indigenous law is so powerful and it looks different across every continent. And when I'm talking about indigeneity as an Indigenous person in North America, like I explicitly mean an expansive, like really open understanding of indigeneity that, you know, I think sometimes in Canada and the US, like Sheryl-Ann was talking about with specificity, like we have to be so careful that we don't take like conversations in Canada around Indigenous issues and then impose them in Southeast Asia or impose them in parts of Africa. That like we really understand like, well, whose stories have storied this place and what can we learn from them? So I think I'll just end there. But like for me, conservation, because it grew out of the global north and it was so intimately tied with empire, that like we really have to challenge, and it's like at every level of it, where, you know, sort of like an example is that in Alberta, there was my mentor, Frank Tuff, recently said, oh, you might be interested that in this really high profile case where Indigenous people were criminalized for fishing without a license, declaring their treaty right to fish. You know, he said that you might be interested to know that the fisheries and wildlife officer who seized the fish said, well, I speak for the fish, when he was in court. And I think that's a really ballsy, bold statement to make as someone acting for the state, to sort of say like, I speak for the fish, not you, Indigenous person who has connections to these fish since time immemorial. And so like disrupting that idea of like any singular state can sort of speak for, you know, the land or the water or the fish is really important. So I'll just end there. But yeah, this is something I think about a lot. And I think there's a lot of well-meaning people in conservation, but if they aren't, like these white people that do this conservation work aren't really thinking hard about like the violences that they might be enacting, it just continues that cycle. And then the people who've really spent lifetimes working with the land aren't centered. So many bad things happen.
Okay, I guess I'll go now. So some examples of how I see white supremacy in the mainstream regarding sustainability. So I before farming and like doing a bunch of stuff that I do now, which is a lot, I grew up food insecure in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Etobicoke. And I remember when I learned about the word sustainability, I didn't fully understand what it meant. For a long time, people I grew up with, my community, I felt like the word sustainability was kind of like held behind like glass doors of scholars. Like it was this lingo and language that, sure, we can talk about sustainability and like greening our parks and like getting more bike lanes and all of that stuff. But what's going to happen to like my friends who don't have lunch money? What's going to happen that we don't have a community garden in our neighborhood, or like you can't ride your bike on the West Mall because you're going to get hit by a car? So I think the intricacy of like white supremacy in the sustainability world comes from how classist it is and how elitist it is. Like I didn't go to school. I like basically dropped out of high school, and for a long time I felt like I couldn't fully understand the word sustainability, but there were so many ways that I embodied it, and my mother embodied it, my friends embodied it. It could be simply that like Black people, and like Sheryl might also know this because she's from the Caribbean, like we eat every part of the animal. We eat the oxtail. Like that's a very popular Caribbean dish in like Jamaica, for example. We eat callaloo and collard greens, and callaloo and collard greens, if you look back into the transatlantic slave trade from Brazil to the Mississippi, callaloo and collard greens can be traced back to both continents, right? The growing of collard greens on the edge of the plantation is the only type of green that someone who's enslaved would be able to eat to sustain themselves and give themselves iron, vitamin K, all the nutrients they need to live. So when we're thinking about sustainability, I think that it's really important to tie it to the Black struggle and the Black liberation, that Black people since like time forever have been using every part of the animal, have been utilizing weeds, have been doing bush medicine, have been doing medicinal work, like from like things out of nothing, roots and barks and everything. So I think sustainability, when we're thinking about it today, maybe we think about like, you know, like Patagonia jackets from recycled bottles, or like that new bike lane that goes to our favorite bistro down the street. But I think it's very important to note that like usually the poorest communities and the most disenfranchised communities, specifically Black, I'm talking about Black people right now, have been the most sustainable because we have been given like nothing. And I think that's something that drives my work every day, because I can see that, and I can see like what I grew up in and what I can do now. So that's the key point. And I think that more often than not, these places that talk about sustainability should like encourage like communities of color, especially Black communities, to like participate in maybe like figuring out what they want in their neighborhood. And the most often thing I'm ever told is people just want a place to grow food and gather. They want a community garden. They want a cooperative. They want a trust. Actually, I spoke to someone really cool from this organization called Cooperative Jackson. They're in Mississippi, and they do amazing work with a bunch of different cooperatives, and they want to create like a self-sufficient system in their city so the Black community can feel supported. That's sustainability, right? Working in community and being able to make things out of really nothing. But even if like the state and the oppressors don't like give you food stamps, you can still survive. So I think that's all I have to say. I think what I said was pretty poignant, though, I hope.
Sounds like the sustainability you're talking about isn't available for purchase in the natural foods aisle of the store. I'm thinking about everything that you've all shared, and I think one of the most challenging things that I encounter, maybe you all as well, is the well-meaningness of the conservation movement and sustainability, like people who work in these fields. And I think I connect it to the superiority that Sheryl-Ann was talking about. And I think it becomes, I think for people who grow up, there's a sort of like halo effect. You already see yourself as somebody that's doing good. So it becomes even harder to accept that you may be causing harm or that you're part of an oppressive system. I find oftentimes that there's sometimes, if you are in a meeting about a bike lane, that planners can often be the most oblivious to how much they are forcing a set of values, because it's just like, we already have the data. It's already better for you. It's already healthy. To have is to convince you that this is better for your community, regardless of what you may say, and that you don't know well enough for yourself. I can't wait to dive into this topic of representation for the last part of this conversation. But before we do that, I'd love to ask again if you each could share a word in relation to unsustainable sustainability, the harms of mainstream sustainability that you would like us to think about as we leave this evening?
Cheyenne, you should go first because you had to go last time.
Okay, thanks for me on the spot there. I got no word, but I'll think about a word right now. Word. I'm gonna say it's 2 words, but I'm okay with that because I'm on the spot. I'm gonna say new growth because I think that sustainability, or oh no, I'm gonna say recycle. That's a better word. Okay, I'm gonna say recycle because I'm not talking about bottles. I'm talking about recycling things. So like compost. I'm talking about oxtail. You can recycle that into tasty things.
All right, well, I can go. I'm going to say sustainability. I'm just cheating. That's like I'm just cheating on this part. But I think sustainability, because it's like, honestly, it's a word I actually very seldom use, to be honest about it. Because I don't know that I want to sustain a lot of the things that we have right now, you know. And so in some ways, right, that idea of sustainability implies that like what we had was really good, and we want to figure out how to like keep it and maintain it. And so I think unsustainable sustainability to me sort of starts to feel like chai tea, like it's just sort of like sustainability is unsustainable. That's my thing.
I guess for me, I'm thinking about capital and how, as long as like we're still working through capitalism, and I know we can't, I'm not shaming people for being I'm a capitalist, you know, like I can't not do it right now, but if we could just eventually not have to order our lives around capital, it'll just, you know, I become more Marxist as I get older, and so and just think that especially getting wealth from billionaires back to the people is really important, like unions, justice, like all of that. Like just, it's disgusting how much money billionaires have made off the pandemic. Yeah. But I'm definitely not here to shame people for, like, we're all entangled in capital. So yeah. Okay, but Cheyenne, you're making a good point. It's not the same. Yeah. So maybe I need to sort of decolonize my relationship to it. But yeah, I just think that I can't wrap my head around how governments in Canada are okay with evicting people right now. Like it just, how can we not be looking after people and making sure that they have a place to live, you know, enough food to eat, and, you know, safe water to drink and all that at a time when we're in a pandemic.
Thanks for that, Cheyenne. I think we're all seeing what you put in chat: to survive and put bread on the table. I do not equate to being a capitalist. It's definitely something for me to think about over dinner tonight. Great, thank you all. I feel kind of terrible. I've just had 2 hours to hoard the questioning, and so I am looking forward to relinquishing that power to everyone else on this call very soon. But before we do that, I have one more question, which is really this last solutions in practice. So representation has come up a lot. I think in some ways it's obvious why that matters. Representation matters. Representation matters in all the ways that all the speakers have talked about. But is it that simple? What else needs to happen? Let's say Indigenous people are represented. Let's say Black people are represented. And as Sheryl-Ann talked about, representation means a lot of different things. But what do we need? Is that enough? I'll just put it that way, and as a very kind of dumb question, and let you all take it from there.
I can go while the thought is fresh in my head. It won't be too long though. I think like this is coming from an abolition point of view, and that's my point of view for many things, is that like I don't see representation as the endpoint. I see it as like justification for the time being, like a thing you have to do to survive to get to the endpoint. I think the endpoint is complete system change, right? I am, for example, a hoity-toity lawyer or like a business person, and I'm the only black lady in the room, and there's all these white men at the table. They might bring me in for representation, right? But am I doing the justice that I can if that same, business is like RBC or TD and they're putting up pipelines, right? I think representation can only go so far because a lot of times what we're representing is we're just being a BIPOC person or a black person within a system of oppression. And again, like, there's only so much you can do under capitalism. And like, I don't truly believe the whole saying that there's no there's no, like, there's always exploitation of capitalism, because like I don't think we can blame ourselves to a certain point. But I will say that like representation is not the end goal. I think the end goal is having the most oppressed and the people who are obviously indigenous of land as well having total say and being able to reform the system and mold it into a way that is just and fair for everyone. But in the time being, to get to that fun point of like sovereignty, whether that be land sovereignty, food sovereignty, or any type of sovereignty, we need to have representation and we need to have voices to say, hey, let's go this way. And those voices still matter. Even if, if I was like a businesswoman and I'm on RBC or TD or whatever, maybe as a black woman, my radical voice would have a shift, would cause a tide, and I could actually turn out to abolish them as a complete thing. So that's what I have to say. Maybe it's like a optimism thing, but I think representation is like on the path of what total sovereignty could look like. But then it also takes the people who are being represented to be radical and to make changes and not to be okay with the power that they may get in the positions. Hope that makes sense.
If I can sort of build on that, I think like one of the challenges with representation, if we're talking about like academic approaches to like sustainability or sort of like ecology, is that like the academy is just built on competition, and it's really hard to like really sort of extract yourself from that and really sitting with like it's easier to do things in a way that the academy recognizes. And so like it recognizes awards, it recognizes grants. It doesn't recognize if you spent like 10 years building really strong relationships with a group of people, but they can't put that in sort of their ledger and say like, yes, even though it brings them so much value to have these relationships. And so I think that, you pay attention to like how Carleton officially, there's nothing that I've seen in writing from Carleton as an institution that admits that it's on unceded territory. And that's because lawyers, I imagine, it comes from the lawyers saying like, you can't say it's unceded because then you might have to give the land back. And yet like we do have land we could give back. There's land that this like mythological land that Carleton owns, but they won't like tell you where it is, but some of the ecology classes apparently get to access it. And, a very simple thing that Carleton could do as an institution is give that land back to Algonquin people, and not in like the ways that Ottawa has tried to approach that, but to actually go humbly to like all the different Algonquin nations, the different communities, and sort of ask like, what does it look like for us to do reparative work with you? How do we repair this relationship? You didn't ask us to be here. We're at, you're on our land. We're on your land. And so like, yeah, building on Cheyenne's point, like representation is like on the road there. But if the people in the room who are being the representatives aren't working from a place of like really understanding that it can't be about competition and ego, like it's really about like, we have to change the way these things work, and like universities have to change. But the road we're going down is that the people on the boards of governors are often developers, lawyers, business people, former media people. And in Ottawa, they're often like really high up former bureaucrats, like clerks of the Privy Council, like people who've had incredible power in Canada from colonial communities, they're not the ones who are going to be like, yes, give the land back, you know? And so I think a lot about, you know, some of us have power that we don't realize we have. Like, I'm a tenured professor. I can talk back to the university. They don't like it, and they're increasingly trying to find ways to shut me up. But like, we have a good union, and I know that I'm always speaking from a place of like integrity and my like reciprocal responsibilities to the Algonquin Nation. So, but I think there's a lot of people who sort of forget, like, actually, if more of us do it together, it actually, the system has to change, because they can't sort of divide and conquer the way that they do now. So yeah, so for me, like, trying to come to things from those teachings I've had from Cree Métis mentors, but they're not ending there either, looking also to like friends from communities all over. You know, like, I work with friends in Borneo and Australia and the US and elsewhere, and like really thinking about like, what does it look like if we just quit caring what these systems think? Which is a lesson I also get from my Métis great grandmothers, who really just did not care about what the church had to say, what the government had to say, and who were troublemakers. And yeah, anyways, sort of like loving troublemaking when done in community can be really powerful. And if we can just like remember that, maybe we have a chance.
Sorry, Sheryl-Ann, just real quick, I just wanted to highlight two things that I'm taking away. One, I thought it was so profound what you said, to ask the question, what does it mean to do reparative work? And to me, that's like a concrete practice that every single one of us as individuals and organizations, institutions, anyone with power can do to well beyond representation, ask the question of what can we do that is reparative, and to be open to hearing. I think that's so amazing. And then the second thing, I think, sounds like organizing. The more of us doing it together makes it hard to divide. And that's a concrete practice as well, with well-established methods and histories of how to do that. So I really, really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
So, okay, so I'll try and be brief, but also I think tying it back also into like the last questions that the organizers asked about the idea of like, if that's okay, Aron.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, kind of asking about the questions around like sort of solutions and practice, which I think is like a very, it's a very comfortable place in some ways, because like, you know, as architects and planners, we like a solution, like we like something we can, so we can do. It's, you know, we don't want to just think about things, but you know, I think so. The question, one of the questions was, what would it look like if marginalized people could lead our response to the climate crisis? And I think going back to like something that Zoe's brought up a couple of times, and something that Cheyenne's mentioned as well, like that's actually exactly what's already happening. You know, if you really look at it, right, the folks that are living in the ways that are sort of the least taxing, right, on the earth, that are like burdening our relationship with the earth the least, are folks who are most marginalized in our centers of formal power. And I think the other thing about that is that they're sort of like there's like this old, it's not that old, but it feels old because everything feels old, but there's this sort of old image of like, there's like a big fish that's like following a bunch of little fish, and but then the little fish like turn around, and in formation they kind of like get the big fish. But it's always this idea, this like this reminder that actually like what has been put at the center of power, what's been put at the center of our curriculums, what's been put as the center in terms of like, you know, what's intellectual or how we create knowledge or what counts as environmentally sustainable, is actually like a tiny drop in terms of like the actual knowledge and practice that we have, right? And it's also quite specific, right? Like it's not even European really. Like for the most part, it's sort of like very, very upper class English, right? Like even people from like the West Midlands don't necessarily recognize what we're talking about, you know, in these things. And I think remembering that it can be really powerful. Like even when Cheyenne was talking about, and also I know what you're talking about, oxtail is a delicacy, so we can, you know, there's no sustainability burden, it's a privilege. But you know, like, but when you're talking about that, I think about like a friend of mine who's Italian who jokes about artichokes, right? And he jokes about like, how like broke do your people have to be to look at an artichoke and be like, yeah, sure, we can get some food out of that, right? And so many of us have these stories, right? These stories of like things that now, you know, are delicacies or things that now are like sort of normal foods, right? That so many of us have, say, food practices, right? That came out of necessity, right? That we elevated into culture. And I think that like, that's the thing that I think about when I think about representation and sustainability and what would sustainability look like if the most marginalized folks were leading our climate discussions? Like, it's already happening. Like, we already have that in our own cultures, right? We already have that in our own traditions, you know, except, you know, in our own traditions and our own, you know, histories. And so I think, you know, taking that time to really learn and elevate your own traditions, right? And learn the traditions of the folks sitting beside you, right? And seeing those commonalities and noticing, right, what are the things that we share, that we do in common, that are in contrast to what we're being told or what we have been told is the highest and best use, right? And so I think it's already happening, and I think we just need to have these conversations, and we need to look for it, and then, you know, elevate it in whatever space we're in.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. I think it's asking. I'm already rethinking some of the ways in which I've been thinking about environmental issues here in New Orleans, and what it means to bring in different voices, and I think that I'm bringing that word attunement to here. How do we recognize what's there? How do we attune ourselves and recognize differently everything that's already around us? And a friend and colleague of mine, Monique Verdun, she's with the United Homo Nation, and she was teaching a palmetto weaving workshop once. And I remember as we're all sitting there fumbling about with palmetto leaves, trying to make something, she said, just seek out find the indigeneity inside yourself. And her point was simply that embedded in every single one of our histories, regardless of where we find ourselves now, that there has been, that there is in us and around us, all these forms of knowledge that where people have been connected to the land and know how to manipulate and use what's around us, and are attuned to the cycles and the seasons and all that. So seeking that out around us and in us, I think is a really powerful practice on top of the organizing and the questioning and everything else. So, questions?
So Aron, I'm going to be helping you out. If someone has a question, you can send it in the chat, or you can put your hand up as a reaction. I'll be taking notes, and I'll be unmuting you, and I'll be like just keeping order. If that's okay, Aron, I'll help you out a little bit with that.
Awesome, thank you. And I think, yeah, anyway, I'll say while people ponder questions they might want to ask, I think it feels luxurious and to be able to spend 2.5 hours with a group of people on a Friday evening, and just taking the time to think about these things and listen to each other. So I appreciate everyone being here and being so open and sharing their expertise and their insights.
Ross, I don't know if you had a question, or if you're just putting your hand up, or just agreeing with what Aron had to say.
I wish you could trace the server farm that Zoom is connected to, that we're all connected through, so to understand we're all rooted in some, maybe it's in Washington or next to a hydroelectric dam somewhere, or
Totally selfishly, also, if people have stories along the questions that we've been chatting about, I would totally selfishly love to hear anybody's stories. I would love to hear like other people's like garbage food that is now delicacy. I don't know if anybody wants to share those ones, but I would love to hear about that.
Jasmine, I think you're muted.
Hi all, I don't have a question as yet, but I did just want to turn on my camera to kind of like simulate the experience of if this were an in-person panel, that, you know, this is a time when the audience would like come more alive and engage with the speakers. So I just wanted to simulate that. No question as yet. Thank you so much, guys.
I do have a question if the audience doesn't mind me interjecting. I can also share like a little tidbit to Sheryl-Ann when you mentioned like and Cheyenne, the garbage parts of the meat. My grandpa was actually a meat processor representative in the Caribbean. And so one of the things he liked to tell us was that on his travels to different meat plants throughout the world, he actually discovered that in places like Ireland or in Europe, they were cutting off the pig's foot and throwing it away. And in Jamaica, that's a huge delicacy. So he made a lot of money by bringing up that idea to his company and importing other people's garbage to make the Jamaican food. And then I had a question, like back to the idea that Cheyenne brought up, in that we have marginalized groups already leading sustainability in their own practices. I wanted to know what your opinions were on the unsustainable practices that may be embedded in marginalized groups, whether intentionally or unintentionally. For anyone.
I think that's, yeah, I'll answer that. So like unsustainable practices, I can give a really quick one. Like part of my adolescence, I lived in a high-rise building, and there's a lot of like, you know, BIPOC family, a lot of marginalized families in the building. And I remember we had a field trip. I think it was to the Ontario Science Center. Does anyone remember the Ontario place? If anyone's from Ontario here, yeah, y'all remember that. And one of the activities was to learn about like compost or like something with biology and like decomposing. Like they had a banana and they showed like the decomposing process. And then they asked us, do you have a compost bin at home? And I remember being like, what is a compost bin? What's that? And a lot of the white kids are like, yeah, I got a compost bin. I put my apples in there, my bananas, my Wonder Bread, my wheat bread. I'm like, whoa, what's that? And I didn't have one, and I asked my friends who also lived in the same building, like, nah, I got no compost bin. And then I realized it's because a lot of our high rises, whether that be also be like Toronto community housing even, they don't have this like compost facilities. And to have a bin in your home that you fill with compost and to bring it to a compost facility, maybe at your community garden, maybe at your community farm, that's like a bus ride away. So you gotta use a token to get rid of your food scraps. So I think the idea of like composting and like that being the biggest thing people to really talk about, at least here in Toronto, regarding sustainability, is that gap that people say, oh, well, like Black people don't care about the planet, Black people don't care about composting. It's like these things are not embedded in our communities. And to compost, the simplest act as a child, I remember I had no clue how to do it because in my building, we only had one garbage chute and that's where everything went. There was not even a recycling bin at the time I was growing up. That's how far back it was, really in the eyes of sustainability. So small things like that, I often think of, it's not the people's fault if the system isn't working for them. The system was never designed for them. So I think it really takes people like planners and folks in municipal government to try to make it more accessible. A really good example is now in my neighborhood, Food Share, a non-for-profit that is like the best, they have an urban farm that's 2 acres. And at the urban farm, my friends who work there, they have a community compost program where they encourage residents in the nearby high-rises to come with their compost and they give them produce in exchange. So people can like do this activity of like composting their food waste and get produce in return. That's pretty wild. So that's an example I can give. But again, most of the time, it's not the people who are marginalized's fault. It's simply because, for me even, we didn't have a compost bin in my building.
We had a question, actually before I move on, Sheryl-Ann, Zoe, anything you guys want to add to what Cheyenne just shared? We had a question in the chat box from Ryan. How can we help with representation as allies? Love to open that up if that's a question any of the panelists want to take on.
I mean, I can jump in as a Métis person from Alberta. I have a white mom and an Indigenous dad. And so thinking about white allies, like a really important sort of aspect of that I've encountered through like community organizing, political work, working in the university, is like stepping back and listening more. For like, this is explicitly aimed at white people, like just that, like not assuming that you are the source of expertise in a space, and just like, you know. And I remember being at a charrette in like 2010, and it was organized by the city of Edmonton. There were planners there, and they wanted to they were re-envisioning how to build parks in the city center, and like a big challenge in Edmonton. It was at the time like had one of the highest driving rates in North America. And so just like tons of surface parking across downtown Edmonton. So all these urban planners and like sort of like urbanism was really cool in 2010 amongst white people. And so yeah, they were all like, what do we got? We have to do something about this. And I remember my dad used to take us to downtown and into the river valley. It's like, that's where I learned where all the plants, you know, in the river valley grow. And I like, you know, how to harvest certain things that grow down there. And so, you know, these people are talking about like, oh, we need like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of things that were cool in 2010 for urbanists that probably are not cool anymore. But, you know, they were talking about like all those things that were cool, like we need more cafes, we need more this, that. And then I remember saying, well, like there's a park in downtown Edmonton called Amiskwaciwaskahigan, or Amiskwaciwaskahigan. It's a different sort of translation of the word Beaver Hills, and Beaver Hills House. And it was always seen by white people as like a dangerous place. They actually like leveled some of the hills in it at one point because they felt that would reduce crime. And I remember saying, you know, in the charrette, what if we grew food here? Like, what if we had like traditional indigenous plants growing here, like Saskatoons and other things that are really common here? And I remember this white planner looked at me and said, well, we don't want people to stay here. And it was just that sort of like, just that like her sense of ownership over that space that was stolen land, that has a Cree name, that has been intensely kind of like policed and like managed, which could be a really great place to just have food. At that point was just like beyond their capacity to think. And I sometimes go back to that and remember like, okay, yeah, if only people who sort of see themselves as allies could just like maybe step back a little bit and realize maybe like they don't even use the space in the same way that other community members do. Like my dad taught us to pick berries in places that I think a lot of urban planners think are just waste sort of ditches. So yeah, so that would be just from an Indigenous perspective. And I see it a lot in the work I'm doing in conservation issues, like just that people assume like I have a PhD, so I'm the expert, but actually people who live in a place have the most knowledge of that place.
So I'll just toss out maybe like two things super quickly. I think the first one is, I think the idea of like the words like joy, strength, and pain. And I think a lot of times that like our allyship, right, with whatever, you know, whatever community is that we want to kind of ally ourselves with, right, or be in allyship with, that's not our own community. I think there has been a sense that like it's because people are like really hurting and they're really in pain, and so we have to like step in and like help. And I think that like speaks to what Zoe's talking about as well. So I think the idea of joy and strength, I think are just two words that I think are really important. And what I mean by that is that idea of like approaching allyship by thinking about the joy and the strength of the communities that you want to support, right? Because there's lots of communities that are, they're marginalized in lots of different ways. And most of the time being a part of that community is not a painful thing. It's actually probably a really joyful thing, and it's a thing that brings a lot of strength, right? So entering into your allyship with that in mind, right? That you are honoring and supporting the joy and the strength of the community that you want to be in allyship with, not that you're trying to like fix their pain. And so Lynn Gell, who is an Algonquin woman, also has this sort of ally bill of responsibilities. And one of the things that she also talks about is the idea of being fully grounded in your own ancestral history and culture. And this goes back to, what Zoe was talking about earlier, right? Is the idea that like you can do this work no matter who you are, right? Even if your history is that you are 8 generations of like very high class, posh British people, like own that and know that you can still do good work, right? You don't have to pretend that you are a part of a community. You don't have to become a part of a community that you want to be in allyship to support and to honor the joy and the strength of that community. And actually you often do harm by not doing that. So again, like really owning and understanding your own, your own history, right? The good and the bad of it. And also recognizing that you're not doing something good for someone else as an ally, but really thinking about the fact that someone else's liberation is tied to or yoked to your own liberation, right? So if you understand your own history, and if it is a history of harm, right, doing that reciprocal reparative work is a way of repairing the harm that you are dealing with, right, sort of ancestrally, so to speak.
I think there's a question about greenwashing that I want to get to, but before, there's a later question from Livia. How do you see the relationship of the representation for Indigenous and Black people in developing countries, considering our social inequality? And I think it might be an opportunity to build on some of the responses you've all just shared before we move to, I think, talking about greenwashing. Is that okay?
I'd just like to introduce myself. I think I'm the only one here who isn't from Canada or United States. I'm from Brazil. And well, I was turned on the camera, but I'm not in a very good light, so you can see me. Is the camera on? Can you guys see me? Hello, I'm Lydia. I'm asking this question because, well, I am here from Brazil. I am not a Black woman, I'm not Indigenous, but here in my university, we talk about a lot about this question. And I would like to hear about you guys, what you have to say about this, as soon as you are not from here, but I know you guys have a lot of knowledge that we don't have, so I would only like to listen from this.
I'd love to actually take a quick stab at it. I think it's obvious through all of our experiences with COVID in the US, ongoing with George Floyd, with that we see that racial inequality, economic inequality, environmental injustice, we see how each one connects to and binds the other. And so we can't solve environmental injustice without solving economic inequality, right? Because if economic power gives you the ability to send a representative to a meeting or to commandeer political power and agency, then you already have more power, period. And I think it's to me, they're inseparable. We can't imagine working on environmental issues without simultaneously addressing other forms of inequality and other forms of disparity, which can, I think, be overwhelming. But I think that kind of ecological mindset where we see the connectivity across these issues is also something that can help us reframe our work and not so be narrow about what we're trying to accomplish, and to see natural allies in the other movements that are around us.
It's something that comes to mind is like a lot of colleagues have been challenging sort of like how scholarship from Canada and the US and Europe really dominates, and Australia, like the Anglo sphere, really dominates a lot of conversations right now. And so I've been working really hard not to recreate that, and to make sure I'm including scholars from South America and, you know, different places that those institutions might not be like listening to. And so, and that's an ongoing project. And like as an Indigenous person, but who does not look, I look white to the world, you know, I'm always very conscious of sort of how I'm interpreted by the institutions I'm talking to, and sort of really trying to be accountable for that. And so in our own work, like we have collaborations across, you know, Canada, the US, and building relationships in other places as well. And it's always been a really, for us, it's really important that we disrupt kind of that, like, just like the monolith of like American and European kind of like, you know, control over discourses. And that, so we're really trying hard. So like, you do know a lot, like I wish we could have had a panel where like we could have maybe in the future, maybe not, I'm like, this panel's beautiful and I'm really honored to be part. I'm not trying to, you know, like that, taking the resources we have and having more conversations with people across more places, like building that capacity is really important, and really making sure that that we share stories across all this. So I'm just basically repeating what Aron is saying, but you know, it is something I'm trying to think about a lot, because I am conscious that I'm in Canada, I'm Indigenous, but I'm in Canada. I teach at a Canadian university. It has power, even though it pretends it's like, gee, shucks, so we're just Carleton, we don't have a lot of power, but they have tons of power. They have, you know, they have money, they have, you know, and so really thinking about, you know, and having really good conversations with people on Twitter who sort of, you know, saying like, why is everything in English? Like, yeah, that's a very good point. Like, I would like to not be speaking English. I would like to be speaking the, you know, languages that my Indigenous ancestors spoke, but, you know, that's an ongoing process of reclaiming. So, yeah, so I'm really learning to sort of like really disrupt my knee-jerk reaction to sort of say like, oh, what is Duke University Press saying today? You know, like there's good work there, but there's other work elsewhere that needs to be centered as well.
There's a question about any thoughts about greenwashing. This is from Maria. Any thoughts about greenwashing in design, marketing, etc.? Developers, for example, developers opting for LEED certified buildings with minimum credits to be able to charge higher rent rates, or companies that market green. Products that are super unaffordable. Yeah, I think we're heading towards our last question or two. So any thoughts that you all would like to share on greenwashing before we?
I can talk about it a bit because I live in Toronto, and it's like, as everyone knows, we have like a condo a day literally being built. I was actually on a meeting. I won't like say too much, but I was on a meeting and it was with all these people who like build condos, and I was talking about urban agriculture in the city or whatever. And I remember distinctively like one of the people that build condos and literally like gentrify neighborhoods that are like working class. They were talking about how they create food security because they have gardens on the condo roof. And I was just like, I started laughing during the meeting, so I had to like take the video off. And I composed myself, and then I said, you don't do food security. And I feel like in Toronto, the biggest issue is these condos are saying, oh yes, we have food security, we have a community garden, but it's straight up a 10 by 10 plot on a rooftop that all the residents share, and there's 7 hostas in it. So I think that's the biggest thing, and I think there's a lot of revolutionary people here in Toronto doing like work against gentrification, whether that be like Keep Your Rent Toronto or the People's Defense, for example, 2 great examples. And I think what it takes is the community saying, no, that's a lie, and asking what are they really going to do, and maybe providing facts. For example, FoodShare has so many facts that they did in collaboration with the University of Toronto that shows Black Canadians, even if when you make everything the same, like status, like housing, job, that Black Canadians disproportionately face food insecurity to white Canadians. So even providing that simple fact and saying a community garden will never solve food security, I think would be a really easy thing to do. And in general, just calling out these companies and these condos. What I've done is I bluntly just tell them that a community garden will not solve the issues if what they're doing is they're going to be raising the rent because they charge exorbitant rates for their condos. So I think it's just about standing up and saying something and making it known. But also if you can back up what you're saying by, like, I don't want to say facts because lived experiences are facts. But a lot of times what I try to do, because people don't respect me as a Black woman, is I have a lot of facts. And even on my website, I have a learning resources page where I have so many facts. And I just hyperlink that. And then it's all there. So the biggest thing I can say is just stand up and just try to confront them if you can. If you don't feel comfortable, maybe ask our ally to take up that.
Yeah, I think that was perfect. So I would love to hear, I'd love to leave space for the last, potentially last question.
Krisha, would you like to ask?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't feel like typing it out in the chat, but well, thank you for this amazing discussion, but I guess I just sort of had like a comment and a question about people, specifically white people, taking marginalized people's sustainable practices and sort of marketing it as their own. Like I have, like my family is South Asian, and everyone in my family, since like the day we were born, we're all vegetarian. Not that I'm trying to gatekeep vegetarianism or anything like that, but it was just kind of funny how in like high school when I'd want to like go out, everyone else would like pick a restaurant that didn't really have vegetarian options, and now those same people are suddenly vegan and like that's trending. Or even like my grandma used to make me drink like turmeric and milk, and now Starbucks has a golden drink with that, and sort of other white people selling that as health benefits. And I guess just like kind of my question about what are your thoughts on like appreciation versus like appropriation in terms of sustainability and sustainable practices, because I understand we're all trying to reach a common goal, but where's the line?
If no one's gonna go, I'll go, and then people can go after me. I think the line is probably when these companies, a lot of times white companies, are making a profit from it. And this profit is also helping greenwash them. So I can give a good example. I grow collard greens. I grow collard greens, so I enjoy collard greens. I also have, a relationship with them. And I'm seeing that these like white farms saw I was growing collard greens, and they're like, oh, they grow better than Swiss chard in the summer because they don't bolt and they're really easy. So they're all growing collard greens now. So what I did in the summer, I was like, okay, I'm going to make a post about it. But I wasn't making a post calling anyone out. I was making an educative post. So I talked about how collard greens have this long history and my relationship with collard greens. And then I spoke a bit about soul food and why it's important to understand the Black community in the States, but also here in Canada, and also like around the world too, relationship with food that is now taken and appropriated and what that looks like. And I can't say for everyone else's experience what appropriation looks like. It can only speak for mine, but it really looks like the profiting off of something that you were once criticized for or demeaned for. So for example, collard greens, I remember as a child, my family told me stories about how that was the green that you could just find, right? You can find outside growing. That wasn't the green that you'd buy at the market. That wasn't like the delicate, soft lettuce that you can make a nice salad with. That was the kind of green that you have to cook over hours and hours, which is a very labor-intensive thing, similar to grits. So I would say that like sharing the story is something that is really beautiful because they cannot sell your story because the story is not them. They have no history with the food. Let's say turmeric lattes. Starbucks didn't create that. Starbucks doesn't have a grandma or an auntie that made those turmeric lattes for them. You do. You have that story, and that's something that you own. That's something that you embody, and that's something they can never take from you. So that's what I've been trying to do. And I've noticed that people, usually if you share that story and you talk about your experience with it, they can really sense why there's something wrong with cultural appropriation. But again, that's just like my community. I can't really speak for everyone, but that's what I've done, is to make my story known and to talk about why this food means something to me. And also, if I notice people are whitewashing something, I say it. But again, I'm an Aries and I can be confrontational at times. So you don't have to do that. But you can say, hey, that's not how the traditional dish is cooked, but I guess this is a fusion way you're doing it. So making it known to not allow the recipes or now the food or the cuisines to be whitewashed into oblivion where it looks nothing like what our ancestors or someone else's ancestors made.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this question goes back to, you know, both what Zoe was saying about sort of capital, right, when that was sort of her last big word. And I also think, Aron, what you were saying too about the idea of sort of like the sort of ecology of these things, right? And what Cheyenne's pointing out, right, is that it's not, I don't know, maybe tell me if I'm wrong, Krishna, but I don't get the sense that you're upset that people are drinking turmeric lattes. But it's the fact that somebody is profiting off of something, right? That has meaning to you. And also that you were harmed for doing, right? That has cost you time, that has, that has cost you time, that has cost you, even just like the relationships, right? The strain of having to be like, hey guys, can we go somewhere where there's vegetarian food, right? Like even that, there's like a little bit of, your time that's been taken up, right? By having to do that over and over again. And so I think that idea of staying focused again on what is the thing, right? Is it like white lady drinking turmeric latte? That's not really the thing, right? The thing really is, why do we have this system where this, massive corporation gets to make gajillions dollars of profit and continue to harm, right, the people and the places and the land, right, that brought us this thing in the first place. There's this is a tangent at the very end of the night, so I apologize, but there's this idea of sort of open copyright. Somebody should remind me what the better term is for this. But so instead of having something copywritten, you can have it sort of Creative Commons, that's it. So Creative Commons. And so in Creative Commons, you can sort of decide how much control that you have over things. You can say like, I took this picture and anybody can use it. Or you can say, I took this picture, you can use it, but you can't change it. Or I took this picture and you can use it, but you have to give me credit for it. And one of the most powerful ones, I think, is it's same as. And so one of the things you can turn on and off is whether or not somebody can use the thing that you produced commercially, right? And so often people will say, well, I don't want it used commercially, but there's this same as version of it, right? And the same as version means that you can do whatever you want. You can use it commercially, you can change it, you can remix it, whatever you want to do. But if you're going to sell something, you also have to copyright it as same as, so it also has to be open. And so I think, again, right, this idea of really shifting those structures that let one corporation or one person or one group of people sort of hoard resources, right? That's maybe the thing that we can focus on.
Zoe,
Total tangent at the end of the night, sorry.
No, that was awesome. Zoe, do you have any last words? And I do have one last thing I'm going to ask everyone to do as they leave. But Zoe, you want to share any last words?
In certain spaces, through the competitive drive, and people just don't really think about all the time, oh, who am I responsible to? What are my relationships, and how can I be a good relation? And so, yeah, Krisha, how you're sort of talking about how those people, yeah, I like that the people who one time made fun of you for you embodying your family's relationships are now it's like an influencer. They're probably putting it on Instagram and talking about this incredible thing that they've discovered. And if we could just stop that drive to sort of pretend you've discovered anything, if you're from a dominant group, then that would just go a long way. But Shannon and Sheryl-Ann put it so beautifully, so I don't want to ramble on beyond this. So, but thank you.
If it's okay with the organizers, I was thinking of, as everyone signs off, to just share in chat a word or phrase they might take away with them from this evening. I would love to see what everyone's thinking. I know personally for me, Cheyenne talking about the land being forgiving, I think that's so profound, and I just want to sit with that thought for a while. So yeah, please drop a word or phrase that you think you might carry with you from this evening into the chat box.
Thanks, Aron. I think that's a really great idea to get the audience who might have felt like they were listening like flies on the wall. Even though I know I'm happy to just listen, but engage with our speakers and you guys. I'd like to thank everyone else for coming tonight. Like from the bottom of our hearts, thanks again to our lovely panelists, Sheryl-Ann, Zoe, Cheyenne. You've taught us so much, and I want to thank you for being vulnerable and poignant in sharing your stories and experiences with us today. And a huge thank you to Aron as well for taking on the role of workshopping with us and being patient and moderating to lead the discussion and draw out these subversive ideas and narratives. Yeah, we're so happy that you guys were able to join us today, and we hope that everyone can take away at least a new perspective, a new word, new ideas of how storytelling can lead to further conversations and exploration of our relationship with the land and equity through sustainability and environmental justice. And maybe there's some way we can save the chat and put it up on our website, create kind of like a word cloud of all the words you guys are sharing. If we can give like a little reaction round of applause, or if you want to put on your videos and thank our speakers for their time.
And thanks again for the organizers. Thanks for doing all of this work on top of the work that you're already doing. Again, right? That idea of time. Thanks for taking the time.
I think too, like, especially that you're doing this at Carleton, like it's a very specific place in a very specific city with very particular histories. And so I think that it's really exciting that you're building this in the architecture school at Carleton. And I know that it's going to have reverberations for many communities, that you're really inhabiting this space with so much care. So like, thank you. Thank you for reaching out and inviting me. I'm really honored to have been included. And Shan and Sheryl-Ann, like, you're both so brilliant. And yeah, thank you for just sharing your work.
Bye. Thanks for having me, y'all. It was very fun. You can follow me on Instagram or chat with me there. I'm very friendly, so I'll probably reply. But yeah, thanks for having me.